Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Deutsch, and I'm going to be presenting this work called Understanding the Extent to Which Summarization Evaluation Metrics Measure the Information Quality of Summaries. And this is work that I did in collaboration with Dan Roth. So reference-based evaluation metrics are the most commonly type of metric that is used to evaluate summarization systems. And this category includes Rouge, BERT score, and many other metrics which you may have heard of. And at an abstract level, what these metrics do is that they compare the similarity of two texts and output a score. So for example, if you take the reference summary and the summary that was generated by a model and passed to the reference-based evaluation metric, and a similarity score is returned. However, there are many ways that two texts can actually be similar. So for example, the sentence at the top is similar to both of the sentences at the bottom. That Federer beat Nadal yesterday is similar to Federer and Nadal's match was close, but I would argue that they're similar because they're discussing the same topic rather than the actual information content. Whereas the sentence on the right, that Nadal lost to Federer, is actually expressing the same information as the sentence at the top. And so I think ideally we want our evaluation metrics to sort of measure this information overlap between the two texts. And so the question for this paper is really, to what extent do current evaluation metrics successfully do this? And so in this work, we're going to measure, or we're going to analyze Rouge and BERT score and to try and answer this question. We're going to provide evidence that they do not capture this aspect well, and show that this is also likely to for some other evaluation metrics. And finally, we'll briefly show some preliminary evidence that a recently proposed metric based on question answering does behave differently. And so in order to analyze Rouge and BERT score together, we're going to reformulate them as scoring two texts based on a weighted alignment. And this is going to allow us to jointly analyze them. So for example, to score these two texts, what Rouge will do is that it's going to create an edge between lexical matches across the two texts, and all of the edges will have weight 1. And then the Rouge score is the sum of the weights divided by some constant for a normalization. BERT score does something similar, except the matches between tokens are based on their the embeddings of their BERT embeddings, and the edges weights will be the cosine similarity. And we're going to use the pyramid method to kind of understand how well they measure information. So the pyramid method is really the gold standard for a manual comparison of the information overlap between two texts. And the way that it works is that if you have two sentences like this, an expert annotator will come through and they will annotate spans with sort of an abstract meaning that that span represents. And they'll exhaustively do that for the two texts. And if two spans in the different texts mean the same thing, they'll mark them as such. So for example, both of the phrases "on Friday" in these two sentences express that the match between Federer and Nadal was played on Friday. And we're going to use this annotation to reason about Rouge and BERT score. So the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to take the SCU annotations and we're going to overlay an alignment, shown here for one that Rouge would find. And then we can calculate what proportion of the alignment comes between phrases which are marked as expressing the same information versus not expressing the same information. So for example, here, only 2/5 of the edges can be explained by matches between phrases which mean the same thing. And that means 3/5 of the score actually is capturing something other than information similarity. And so we calculated what proportion of Rouge and BERT score can be explained by such matches between the summary content units on the TAC 2008 dataset. And we found on average that only 25% of Rouge and 15% of BERT score can be explained by such matches. And we believe this is evidence that Rouge and BERT score are really not measuring what we want them to. We also do an analysis, a similar analysis based on some other types of categories. So we can ask what proportion of these metrics can be explained by matches between nouns or verbs, as well as higher order categories that do things like capture predicate argument relations. So for example, we could calculate what proportion of an alignment can be explained by matches between verbs and their subjects. And what we find is that maybe unsurprisingly, that most of Rouge and BERT score can be explained by noun and stop word matches, and very little can be explained by matches between like subject, verb, object tuples. And in order to analyze other metrics, we could repeat this whole process, but that could be kind of time consuming. So what we did instead was we calculated the correlation, the summary level correlation between a whole bunch of other metrics and Rouge and the pyramid score, which is a score derived from the SCU annotations. And what we found is that all of the other metrics correlate more strongly to Rouge than they do to the pyramid score, which we sort of take as evidence that they're going to behave more like Rouge than the pyramid score itself. However, one metric, QAEval, had the lowest difference between the two correlations. And so we briefly repeat the analysis which we did before with this metric. So QAEval automatically generates and answers questions about the two texts in order to be able to score the summaries. And this also can be viewed as an alignment, where we have these two sentences here. QAEval is going to generate questions from the first sentence and try to automatically answer them against the second sentence. And if there's a match, then we're going to assume that there's an edge between those two tokens. And so if we repeat the analysis, which we did before, we actually find that on average, about 42% of QAEval can be explained by such SCU matches compared to the 25 and 15% of Rouge and BERT score. And there's a much larger number of instances for which the QAEval score can be explained by, there's a large number of instances for which a larger proportion of the QAEval score can be explained by such SCU matches. And we think that this is sort of preliminary evidence that it actually is capturing something which is more desirable that we'd like to measure about in our summaries. And to conclude, I argued that Rouge and BERT score largely do not measure the information overlap between the two summaries, although there are some caveats that these results are potentially data set dependent. And we showed evidence that QAEval does appear to behave differently, which is sort of more evidence that such QA-based evaluations are actually worth exploring more in future research. And I hope that this presentation encourages you to think about what your evaluation metrics are actually measuring and not just use their evaluations as sort of a black box that outputs a score that we want to optimize. Thank you for watching.